Good afternoon, and thank you for being here at the church. We're super excited to have this incredible program that we're offering you thanks to Carl Safina, Drew Lanham, Laurie Anderson, and the great Paul Winter. I'm here to introduce one of the most inspirational and astonishing people I've ever known. That's Laurie Anderson. She's described on her website as a visual artist, composer, poet, photographer, filmmaker, electronics whiz, vocalist, and instrumentalist, meaning that she plays many, many instruments. She's an astonishing musician. I have to say, she's traveled the world, she's performed everywhere, and she's an extraordinary humanist and activist as well with her work. To which all of those above things I would also add philosopher and I think prophet. She's a little bit of a prophet, and I've been astonished every time I've ever encountered her, seen her perform, and I know that she still has a lot more to teach us. So, Laurie Anderson.
Thank you. I'm an audio professional. It's so nice to be here. Thank you so much for coming on this beautiful day. And thank you, Carl, for inviting us all to join you in this experiment. I'm not really sure what's going to go on. So we're going to talk about our work and nature and life. Other than that, I'd like to introduce Carl. Here he is. I want to also say, thank you to Paul for that. What a beautiful, beautiful piece. And Carl, I'm been a fan of your writing for many years, and so thanks for organizing this.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. I think this is. It's on. It is on. Okay. I want to thank you and all the other panelists for coming, and all of you for making it worth our while to wrangle these incredible schedules of these people to be here for an afternoon of lifelong conversation with the living world in words and birds and music. The only thing April left out about Laurie's resume that's worth mentioning is that if Laurie ever is out on your boat, you get boarded by the Coast Guard. Every time. Don't know why. And as far as wrangling our schedules, I have to say that when I sort of tepidly asked Laurie, would you consider maybe the possibility of joining us for this event? Like 10 seconds later, she emailed me back. She said, I'm in. That's the kind of friend you like to have. So what the one commonality here, and I think the commonality that prompted April to ask me to get something together is that we're all affiliated with my not-for-profit group, which is called the Safina Center. And I'm an ecologist and a writer. Formerly, I worked a lot on conservation policy and things like that. But my not-for-profit does something that, well, we try to be unique in that we are not only trying to inform people about what's happening with the natural world and what's at stake. We're trying to transform people. And all of the work that I try to do and the other people who are affiliated with my center strives to make an emotional connection, not just give you information. There's plenty of information. Information alone is not enough to change the world. Really, only hearts can change the world, and hearts must change the world, and we're working to try to make sure that hearts do. So that's a bit about me and the Safina Center. So I would like to introduce Drew Lanham and Paul Winter to come and join us up here. That's your cue, guys. But actually, Paul's going to join us later again. But I have to read an introduction to Drew because, you know, like the Plains Indians, they had those headdresses where every time they did something noteworthy, they got a feather. So you could just look at them and see. But our way of doing it is we have to read lists of awards. That's our headdress. So you were spared mine generously. So Drew is a prose writer and a poet. He focuses on wild places and how personal and societal conflicts can put conservation at odds with culture. He's won awards from the National Audubon Society, North American Association for Environmental Education, Center for Biological Diversity, a number of other places. Drew is an alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology at Clemson University and was the poet laureate of Edgefield, South Carolina. His book, The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, was a finalist for the John Burroughs Medal and received the Reed Award from the Southern Environmental Law Center. He was named a 2020 that book was named the 2020 Scholarly Book of the Decade and the 2020 Memoir of the Decade. A viral video in which Drew was featured, 9 Rules for the Black Bird Watcher, brought international attention to the dearth of diversity and inclusion in birding, and his various creative works and opinion pieces appear in Orion Magazine, Vanity Fair, Oxford American, High Country News, something called Bitter Southerner. That's interesting. I'm a really bitter Northerner at this point. Terrain, Places Journal, Literary Hub, Newsweek, Slate, NPR, StoryCorps, Threshold Podcast, Audubon, Sierra Magazine, This Is Love Podcast, and the New York Times, among others. Drew's forthcoming book is called Range Maps, Birds, Blackness, and Loving Nature Between the Two, and that will be published soon. Drew lives in Seneca, South Carolina. Is it done? All right. He lives with his wife, Janice. They have 2 adult children, Alexis and Colby. I hope I didn't leave anything out that was important, but Drew is going to read a couple of pieces, and then I will read a couple of pieces, and Laurie will read a couple of pieces, and then Paul will come back and play, and then we'll see what happens.
Thank you, Carl. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here with Laurie and Carl and Paul. Really, it's sort of a surreal day for me because this is a convergence. And this time last year, we dared not all be in the same room, right? And so I think there is some gratitude that's due for that. What I'd like to share a little bit of today is not necessarily from my books or, well, here we go. As Laurie said, it's an experiment. And so my mind changes sort of with the wind at times, but certain winds that blow of inspiration from conversations with friends. Sometimes people that you barely know can bend your ear. This is a piece that I wrote in honor, in part, of Paul. It's called Prayer for the Wild Things. Wildness is the God I worship. The sins to answer for in transgressions are intrusion and extinction. Evolution is the miraculous creation story. The difference between this adaptation and that mutation, primed by time and selection, derive the calculus of our being in this moment. The primordial ooze slime-molded Adam, who spilled his seed as would homeward salmon swimming upriver from the sea. Lucy of the Olduvai Gorge blossomed to Eve plantigrated, fruiting to send wind-blown fluff to the far reaches, finding fertile crescents on which to plant the peoples of this earth. It was always her choice. She was no spare rib ripped from him, but a being of her own womb conceived. Never less than, she is Mother Gaia, nurturer goddess of us all. On the seventh day, billions of years from the first, God still cannot take a break. The rock slung out with a bang from the dark to rest third from the modest dying star throbs and pulses under a cloud of human combusted funk. When our gills and fins gave way to legged lungs with opposable thumbs, the end began. There have been many floods since the beginning and several arks built on a promise of never more. I'm wondering if that raven that never came back didn't return because it didn't want to get eaten like the witless white dove with the olive branch. Could it be that it was too damn smart and too deeply black to fall for the drunken old sailor's trick? Says the great ebony corvid in big-beaked agreement. My grandmother used to sing the promise, God sent Noah the rainbow sign, said it won't be fire, but water next time. That was the promise her angry God kind of made. Turns out, he might have been half right. The next end coming is already here, rising around our ankles, rising past our assumptions of it stopping sooner than later. But it was glacial ice just a little while back. The earth is on a slow burn trying to drown itself back to cool. Mountains rose and are yet falling, ground down grain by grain from granite to pebbles to sand to silt. We are all just the alluvium sliding back to sea, ashes to the Atlantic, pebbles to the Pacific, all ground like ground sand under pumice. We are dust in the wind. Meanwhile, Cain slays Abel daily by chokehold and gerrymander. Polar bears suffer injustice these days. Turns out that God liked it best when the whole mess was all connected in a single congealed Pangeic mess, easier to walk from pole to pole without getting one's feet wet in one great sea. Seems some days like we're headed back to that singularity. Wondering, too, if extinction is forever, why are we still here? If restoration ecology means making things like they were, when do I get my sanity back? So let us pray, or pause, or ponder as we will, find within ourselves the greater spirit that flows between us all, human and not. I'll ask you to lift your hearts and cloud float like swallow-tailed kites. O great wild that is in every weed beyond some intended spot, O bountiful bestiary that stoops with peregrine falcon speed and sings the thrush's summerwood hymns, wildness that growls and howls or hoots as would the river bottom barred owl. How, dearest wild thing that hops and hovers, that slithers, that skulks and slides, how you thrill us For land that rises through heaven as mountains peak and sits low beneath black water as cypress swamp, hear our pleas to be a part and not separate from you, that we in our knowing ape unknowing humble ourselves to care and not be callous, that we in our arrogance of control loosen death's grip on life to let go so that we might live, that we in all we are understand all that we are not. Let the wild things all sing, growl, chirp, call, bellow, or howl. Oh! Now I wonder, where shall I pray these prayers to the miracles of migrating wood warblers and the resurrection of dream-drowsy, heavy-bellied grizzly boars? Where might a Chinook salmon be a sacrificial saint post-spawn to be reincarnated through that bear shit to spruce and the angels rise from chrysalis jewel to fly on tissue-papered wings and sip sweet nectar spilled from fire flowers in fallow fields? Where might salvation be found in salt marsh and redemption rise on surf? Where might green be the hue of hope and same air, same water, same soil, same earth, same fate? Be the unifying creed of same unfettered, unpolluted, no knees on our necks breath? Where does the separate recalibrate to common work? I say that conservation demands a church. No, I'm not speaking of any high steeple, stained glass, temple wall place to worship some deity we can neither see nor feel, but rather let's cast our lots into some unified knowing that what we have to do is communion over the work and then in like-minded gathering to imbue some hope that what we act to save will make tomorrow better than today. God may have 100 legs, 8 arms, 4 hooves, or 2 gill plates for all we know. He, she, or it, and they will be kind and loving with no vengeance or hell or heavenly paradise as club or moral carrot. The offerings will come in noticing, in watching, in listening, in feeling, in being. Love and respect will be the result. Given the current state of Earth's affairs and convergent human-created plagues, I think that conservation needs church and communion too. Let's render the wine from wild grapes. Let's press it from pawpaw and persimmon. Let's eat out of the community garden in some gathering and sharing with common contemplation, with hellish fires burning the world up from the ice caps down, the West in constant conflagration, and another flood drowning polar bears and little black girls in the lower Ninth Ward in the same hot breath, with no arcs to board, with brimstone falling in the form of policies torn apart as viruses leap from wild beast to human beast and back again, as we in the meantime kill one another with random acts of violence. It seems time to regather the congregation of wildlings for some sort of meditative dawn chorus. A dawn chorus where singing clarifies the fog in which we are wandering. There must be some coming together in concerted wonder and worship of all those concerned with being here in some semblance of peace with other beings and ourselves. No judging deity hovers over we can neither see nor feel, but rather some unified knowing, and each of us flock together being consciously raised to a power of action, that what we have to communion over is the work we do, and then in like-minded gathering, hope, hope, hope. I contend that there is no need for bricks or mortar, no trusses or beams, no steeples. Instead, tall trees, prairie grass, pluff mud, clay loam, sand, Arctic ice, accessible green space, and city parks with no harassing, assaulting, racist dog walkers, please. Our scripture will adhere to the science. It will be the science. Rigorous investigation and data objectively gathered, chapter and verse. What, how, when, where, why. We'll pass it by our peers for choir review, but then beyond the tomes we shelve, we must mission out the words in heart-rending ways. Let the data live in horn and voice and drum. We will defund hate and defend the feelings that some wanted screwed over. Rattlesnakes on flags coiled to not be tread on will be released to crawl back into the Chickasaw plum thickets where they belong. We'll work with those hand in hand who know the way forward is by including, not excluding. But for those who insist on denying and decrying any greater good but themselves, we will move on alone with kindred spirits who care. And Brother Marvin Gaye will sing the ecology, and it will be timeless and good, but those damn lyrics finally not so presently meaningful. We will sing Mercy, Mercy Me in response and mean it. Humpback whales will sing in chorus. Icarus will learn from his fall to watch with wannabe bird ego detached. And the wild birds, the wild beasts, and the humanity left over will all say together, peace.
I don't want to go after that, do you? Okay. You want me to? Okay. It's a hard act to follow. My dog Chula, a 50-pound brown wolf more or less, goes loping along the shore, as is her custom, energetically invested in the obvious truth that all adventure lies at the tip of one's nose. The familiar is always also the exotic, and if you can detect that scent and follow it, it'll take you far. And soon, as always, she's way ahead of me. Today we woke to glass-calm water. Napeague Bay is stretched taut to the far points of land. Out across the open water, the sea blends skyward without horizon. On a morning like this, going to heaven wouldn't be worth it. So a question arises: what ought we do? It's an old question. Aristotle helped get the ball rolling 2,300 years ago, saying, plants exist for the sake of animals. Animals exist for the sake of man. It must be that nature has made all things specifically for the sake of man. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s believed that only humans have an eternal soul, that God gave all the animals to people for our use, and that people can kill or use animals however we desire, quote, without any injustice. The world is made for man, not man for the world, declared Francis Bacon. René Descartes believed animals lack consciousness and could be treated without any concern for their well-being. He declared men the lords and possessors of nature. Immanuel Kant believed that each moral being has the right at all times to be treated respectfully, but there was a catch: only humans, or moral beings. And to Sigmund Freud, civilization's entire rationale was to, quote, defend us against nature. These architects of Western values drew a chalk circle around humanity and erected a firewall between us and the rest of creation. They may sound arrogant now, but their time was not our time. The world, so far as they knew it, didn't need our sympathy. That humans might ever acquire the power to harm the world could scarcely have crossed their minds. Charles Darwin's great insight blasted a crater in the philosopher's firewall between humans and nature with his realization that all the world is kin. He wrote, "There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator into a few forms, or into one, and that whilst this planet has gone cycling on from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved." Darwin's insight blurred borders, placing us on a continuum in an organic tree of life. Like Copernicus, like Galileo, here was a genius realizing we're not the center of the circle and pushing the boundaries outward. Aldo Leopold marked this wider perimeter with his softly stated revolution called the land ethic. He wrote, "The land ethic simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it." In all the history of Western philosophy, no one had ever quite come out and said, "We are part of this world." Imagine that. In a universe devoid of any detectable life, any life we might discover would be immensely meaningful, and we are that meaning. And what we see, says the poet Mary Oliver, is the world that cannot cherish us, but which we could cherish. Perhaps life itself is the great unrequited love of all time. Well, down along the shoreline, a red-winged blackbird calls, and then listens, and then calls again. One note is not music. It's what lies between notes that makes music. And what is between them is their relationship. Relationships are the music life makes. Context creates meaning. Asking what is the meaning of life is the wrong question. It makes you look in the wrong places. The question is, where is the meaning in life? And the place to look is in between. That was from my book, The View from Lazy Point, which has very, very local origins and roots. If I may, I'm going to read you another passage. This is from my most recent book, which is called Becoming Wild. And here we are in the Peruvian Amazon, just as it is about to break daylight. As the night's shades rise and the eyelids of morning begin to open, the world retells its creation story. I was expecting something like the explosive dawn chorus of springtime in the Northeast, but here the sun comes up slower, and so does the chorus. This chorus starts with chanting. Dawn's main meditation soundtrack begins with razor-billed curassows who call like this. Inhale, hold, exhale, and with each exhalation, send a deep resonating whoo, like a giant dove. As the curassows coo their ohms into the ravine, their meditative tolls get overlain by 3 soft, intensely plaintive whistles. And these are the affirmations of the undulated tinamou. These 2 calls somehow reach each other inside my mind and mesh into one of the most beautiful things I've ever heard. The slow rhythm feels like the whole forest is breathing. A forest at dawn can seem like the quietest place on earth, and yet it sparkles with sound. While the infinity of stars above underscore the vast vacuums of space, the notes of Earth's living come across the quietude as frogs and trilling insects yield to bird songs. Susurrations and declarations, greetings and exclamations, all the living lit in conversation. Silence is not the absence of sound. It's the absence of noise. There are reasons to love so magic an interlude, but residing deeper than reason is the felt music of such plush silence. Dawn is the song that silence sings. In a recess of the world such as this forest, you can still hear the magic. Outside such whittled hideaways, one species fills up all the spaces between the notes. Nonetheless, I'm cheered by the thought that as the eyelash of daybreak rolls endlessly across the planet, a chorus of birds is eternally greeting a new dawn. Don Brightsmith, who has brought me into this new magic, notes the approach in the pre-dawn of 2 scarlet macaws who are just silhouettes screeching. 2 additional scarlets flying over the tree canopy remain dusky shapes against thin clouds. While the sky is still blue-gray, degrees of illumination cue others to appear on the soundstage. Oropendulas begin calling. Their notes sound like big drops of thick liquid. Motmots begin adding their rhythmic tom-toms. Their notes are so meditative and soothing that they set my mind adrift like a boat in long swells. Rise, subside. I'm afloat in an emerald sea amidst shoals of birds. The volume comes up, until we are wrapped in a shimmering surround of songs and calls, some melodic, some emphatic. I want to know everything there is to know about this place, but not right now. For just a few minutes, I want to feel what there is to feel, to inhale this new oxygen, notice each sight, sound, scent, hear each call, distinguish each note in the orchestra. I want to pay attention and then relax and let the great music wash over me while there remains the room and the time for it in this unruined corner of the world. The ode to joy that enlivens this planet, our home, generates information, of course, and it generates joy's byproducts, mystery and tragedy. The tragedy is that we humans have so overwhelmed ourselves in a, quote, information age, where our own signals crisscross and messages bombard us and everything beeps for our attention so that we've stopped listening. But still the whole world continues calling out. For a few minutes I am listening. This tropic dawn, slow-handed as love, rushes nothing. It savors its own time as it celebrates its daily rite of passage. It literally dawns on me that countless generations of singers who've continually come and gone have performed this soundtrack of renewed existence daily here for countless thousands of years. And if all had been as it was supposed to be, there'd be no end in sight. Just as the streaky clouds get edged with a palette of pinks, a few Amazon parrots arrive on shuddering wings. Landing above the bluff, the parrots talk, talk, talk. In a few minutes, it will be 8 a.m. How long and rich a morning can be if you bring yourself fully to it. Come to a decent place. Bring nothing to tempt your attention away. Immerse in the timelessness of reality. Attention paid is repaid with interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. It is so wonderful to be with all of you, I can in a place where everybody is so aware of nature and living so close to it. So it feels like a very wonderful topic to be thinking about today. And thank you for this beautiful. That was like 21st century Ecclesiastes or something. That was like. Amazing, beautiful text. Thank you. And Carl, thanks for your amazing ideas about how we create meaning and what that is. I'm also going to read a short thing about some birds, and it has some words. And a while ago, I have a friend who was thinking about, is there an emotion that all humans have in common? Is there something that we all feel? And she thought of this for a long time. Like, what could it be? Joy, curiosity, guilt. What is it that everyone feels? And she came up with one thing, which is fear. And so this is a story about fear, and about some things that we share with certain kinds of animals as well. So this is a story I wrote about almost 20 years ago, and I thought it would be a good one to read today. It's called From the Air. I live in downtown Manhattan, next to the West Side Highway, right near a major tunnel into the city. And for the last 3 years, my corner has been a police checkpoint, and there are constant sirens and blockades. And during orange alerts, motorcades of police cars go screaming up the highway as they train for maneuvers. And across the street, hidden at the end of the pier, there's the new FBI headquarters. So lately, I've tried to get out of town as much as possible. So I've been going on these long 10-day walks. And last spring, I decided to go to the mountains, and the idea was to take a trip with my dog, Lolabelle, and now our working dogs, and they're all about security, and they're bred to protect borders. And so they do constant perimeter checks, looking for any suspicious holes or breaks in the walls or just little irregularities. So I took Lolabelle to California, up into the northern mountains, to a little isolated cabin near a Zen monastery. Now, most days, we walked down to the ocean, which took several hours, and we almost never saw anyone on the trails. And Lolabelle would trot in front of me on the path, checking it out, doing a little advance work, a little surveillance. Occasionally, out of the corner of my eye, I'd see some turkey vultures circling this very, very lazy way up in the sky. And I didn't think much about it. And then one morning, suddenly, there they were, swooping down right in front of me, and I could smell them before I could see them. This wild and super funky draft of air, like somebody's really, really bad breath. And I turned around, and they were dropping down through the air, lowering themselves straight down vertically like helicopters, with their claws wide open right on top of Lolabelle. And then I saw Lolabelle's face, and she had one of these brand new expressions. First was the realization that she was prey, and that these birds had come to kill her. And second was a whole new thought. It was the realization that they can come from the air. I mean, I never thought of that. A whole 180 more degrees that I'm now responsible for. It's not just the stuff down here, the roots, the trees, the dirt, but all of this, too. And the rest of the time, we were in the mountains, out on the trails, She just kept looking over her shoulder and kind of trotting along with her head in the air. And she had this whole new gait, really awkward. Not with her nose to the ground following the smells, but pointing straight up, sniffing, sampling, scanning the thin sky, like there's something wrong with the air. And I thought, where have I seen this look before? And then I realized it was the same look on the faces of my neighbors in New York in the days right after 9/11, when they suddenly realized, first, that they could come from the air, and second, that it would be that way from now on. It would always be that way. And we had passed through a door, and we would never be going back. I'm going to, thank you. Thank you. I'm going to read a little story about some mountains. And this is from a project I did a few years ago called Happiness, and it was I wanted to put myself in different situations where I didn't know what to do, what to say. I was very, very uncomfortable, and just to see what would happen, just to get out of my rut. So to find what is happiness. So this is called the Green River. Last spring, I learned about a trip organized by a Buddhist group in New York. And the idea was to canoe down the Green River in Utah for 2 weeks in total silence. And then every evening we would study the work of a 13th century Japanese Zen master, Dogen, who believed, among other things, that mountains are aware. And I thought this sounded great. So I decided to go. Now before we left, I read some books about Dogen, and one was called Enlightenment Unfolds. And in this book, he tells several stories that are hundreds of years old. And one was about a meeting of a teacher who came from India to visit an emperor in China, Emperor Wu. And so the two meet, and the emperor says, you know, I've done so many things, built temples, copied sutras, supported the monks, and I'd like to know what all this is worth. And the teacher said, there is no worth. And the emperor said, so why is that? And the teacher said, these things are not real, but shadows. So what is worth? Said the emperor. And the teacher said, worth is empty and is not in things. The emperor said, what have you come to teach? And the teacher said, emptiness, vast emptiness. And the emperor said, who is it that faces me? And the teacher said, I don't know. Now, I really admire people who have no idea who they are, or even that they are anyone at all. So I kept on reading, and in the rest of the book there were lots of koans and poems and lots of lists of things to do when you're on a pilgrimage. And one was, 1, don't pay attention to loud noises and shouting. 2, don't watch herds of pigs. 3, don't stare at big fish, the ocean, bad pictures, hunchbacks, or puppets. 4, don't pretend you have something in your closed fist if you don't. Now, some of the book made sense, but most of it really didn't seem to apply that much to Utah. But I tried to memorize as much as I could so I'd have something to think about in the long weeks of silence to come. Now, as it turned out, there were 10 of us, and we were met by another group when we got to the Green River, and by chance, it seemed like they were all women except for one man. But the other group was also a sort of outward-bound nature group. And they had a lot of rituals and songs and ways of doing things that has sort of been cobbled together from Indian lore and various self-help programs. And we quickly realized that the trip was going to have very little to do with silence. They would start each morning greeting the dawn with a piercing, wordless, atonal song. And every evening there's a ritual called the wooden spoon, which was you sit around a campfire and you pass a spoon around and you talk into it like a microphone, telling stories about your life, which was probably the ritual we hated the most. But by this point, we realized that we had to do things their way, since they were the ones with the maps, the food, and all the canoes. Our group was always making mistakes, like stepping on a certain rare moss or shitting in the wrong place and spilling dishwater near the river. And every time we did something like that, they would jump up and down and scream, "We don't want to be nature Nazis, but you are poisoning the river, you're poisoning nature, you're poisoning her." And the camp cook would like run up and down and throw herself around on the ground and start screaming. And we never really talked about why we didn't assert ourselves. Maybe it had something to do with a Buddhist approach of, going with the flow. But it seemed like every day it got worse. They talked constantly. And sometimes I heard them whispering together about survival, about being survivors. They didn't seem to have been on any of the TV reality shows about survival. But as it turns out, this group was also an incest support group. And they all told their stories over and over again about what had happened. And then one night during the wooden spoon, two of them said that they were dying and that they had only a few months left to live. But by this time, I had no sympathy for any of them. I no longer felt, that I could listen to their stories. They were martyrs and control freaks and losers. Everything I saw in myself and hated. I no longer felt I could look at the mountains to try to see if they were aware. It didn't seem to make any sense. The trip went on. It hardly ever rained, but giant clouds flew over and rain poured out of them. But it was so dry that the rain evaporated before it hit the ground. One day, I climbed up the bluffs to the top, and up there was another world of mesas, stretching as far as you could see. And you could see the Green River cutting through it. There were these huge formations of red rock that looked like mammoth rabbits and run-down old barns the size of cathedrals. It didn't seem like they were thinking at all. And when you climbed them, the rock would crumble in your hands like a cheap stage set. And then I noticed that everything there looked like it was caught in mid-action, like stills from a disaster film. Rocks teetered on the edge of the cliffs about to fall. Boulders were balanced halfway down the steep precipice. Caught in time. Caught in a moment, like I was. Next we have, we're going to play.
I just want to observe one thing. You said that where you lived in the city, there was a new FBI building, and then you decided to get out of town. Those FBI people called the Coast Guard. That explains it.
Back to the Coast Guard, yeah. I'm a Coast Guard magnet, in case any of you want to call them on. I seem to have that knack.
Drew, did you have another piece you wanted to read?
I have a short poem.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Is that better? So in the introduction that Carl so graciously read, you can shorten it to 2 words, really, bird brain. That's who I am. And so as an ornithologist, a lifelong bird watcher, I've spent a lot of time thinking about birds in many different ways. And as birders, bird watchers, we go through a progression of understanding birds. First, just really in noticing them and that they fly, mostly. But then we move to these progressions of field marks, right? And sort of this reductionist act of wing bars and tail flashes and beak length and plumage color, and those sorts of things that we explode the birds apart to know who they are. And more recently, in my evolution, I suppose, I've come to think about birds more frequently, not as whats, but as whos. And so in this book this book of poetry called Sparrow Envy, A Field Guide to Birds and Lesser Beasts, this is Field Mark 1. It's called Love for a Song. Love is barter. Love is bits of affection traded for pieces of adoration. Love is desire doled out on the whippoorwill's summer wanting. It is our craving for the meadowlark's ringing song, our longing from spring's greening, from our sun-starved spirits down to our bare-toed roots. We seek the winding path and wander until we find the sweet spots. Blackwater cypress swamp, tall grass prairies sweep. The place where moonlight glancing off of tide-slicked stones has made us weep. We want the wild soul, and a shadow-dwelling wood thrush heaps it on us in self-harmonizing sonata. We revel in wildflowers' bloom. We marvel in the migratory sojourns of birds dodging falling stars. Sink yourselves deep in the dizzying dance of pollen-drunk bees. Find hope in the relieved canopies of the tallest trees. Wind and water, storm and surf, they can move us to other ends. That, my friends, is the turn on. That is the honey-sweet seduction. Nature asks only that we notice. A sunrise here, a sunset there. The surge, that overwhelming and inexplicable thing in a swallow's joyous flight, or the dawning of new light that melds heart and head into sensual soul. That is love. Thank you.
We've heard from Paul Winter at the very beginning, but now we're going to hear about Paul Winter. His musical odyssey has long embraced the traditions of the world's cultures as well as the voices of the world's wildlife, what he refers to as the greater symphony of the earth. He had a college jazz sextet that toured Latin America for the State Department and performed the first ever jazz concert at the White House. And then his consort, the Paul Winter Consort, which is still touring and recording, took him to 52 countries, to wilderness areas on 6 continents. He's performed 3,000 concerts, more than 3,000 concerts, and recorded over 50 albums, of which 7 have won Grammys. The voices of the world of nature have long been part of his musical community. Over the years, he and his colleagues have evolved a unique genre called earth music, celebrating creatures and cultures of the planet. Through music, Paul has found a means to connect people to a sense of place, to promote relatedness to the larger community of life, to assist groups supporting local cultural and biological diversity. In recognition of his musical and ecological work, he received a Global 500 Award from the United Nations, Joseph Wood Crutch Medal from the United States Humane Society, a Peace Abbey's Courage of Conscience Award, the Spirit of the City Award presented at New York's Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and an honorary doctorate of music from the University of Hartford. And I guess I would also observe that Paul has, I think, the longest running gig in the world, a 40-year-long gig at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine for the winter solstice, which when I was in my 20s, I always used to try to sneak up to the expensive seats, and the guards always caught me and sent me back to the back. Many years later, I mean, just really like with Drew and with Laurie, these people have all been heroes of mine from afar, and then many years later, somehow I managed to meet them and realize they were heroes of mine because we're all soulmates. That's what brought us together. Somehow, the magnetic attraction of souls that we seem to have here. So anyway, I'm going to introduce Paul with the gong, with the meditation bell. How do you do this? With the red part or the wooden part? Okay. My first time. Drew mentioned a bird called the wood thrush. Paul is going to play a piece about that bird. That's one of the connections.
Wow, thank you, Carl. I didn't remember half of that. During the many years that I've lived in the hills of Northwest Connecticut, I've had a long-running love affair with one of the most iconic voices of our summer forest, the wood thrush. Excuse me, Laurie, I don't mean to be standing in front of you. Let me get my correct. Each wood thrush has his territory of a few acres, and each has his signature song, which he sings morning and night throughout the summer as a way of announcing that he is available for partnership with a female who might be passing through. And one morning, a few years ago, I heard a new wood thrush song near our cottage, and I was thrilled. I'd not heard this one before, and I listened eagerly each morning and night. And one morning, hearing him coming through the window of the open window in the living room, I went to the piano and found that he was singing in the key of C. So I began referring to him as my C major wood thrush. And each morning I would put my tape recorder near the base of his tree and go away, leave it running in the hopes that he might alight near the mic and I could get a really superb recording. He sang with us all summer, and then near the end of August, I heard him no more, and I missed him. But I realized that his job for that breeding season was finished, and it was time to go back to his wintering grounds in Costa Rica or wherever. I was thrilled the next June to hear that he had returned. singing his same song in C major. 5 years in a row, he graced our woods. And needless to say, he became my muse. And all during those years, I was imagining creating a piece of music that would showcase his voice and celebrate the unbridled spirit of optimism that propels him to migrate thousands of miles every year from Central America to Connecticut and back, to fulfill his purpose in life, to propagate his kind. One day I was playing my horn along with a recording of the wood thrush, and I had a stunning realization. Each wood thrush song usually has 4 phrases, and in each phrase there are 3 notes. And the 3 notes of each phrase outline a chord. And so there are 4 different chords. And I suddenly realized that the 4-chord sequence of this wood thrush song was the exact same first 4 bars of the famous prelude of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, which is, of course, in C. And as if that weren't enough, it's also the first 4 bars of the equally famous prelude to Bach's cello suites. So I know of no word for a coincidence this extraordinary. It's simply a musical miracle. So all this called out to me for a musical weaving. And so I had this fantasy of old JS and the Birds stumbling into a little Brazilian party, and a good time is had by all. I call this the well-tempered wood thrush.
Laurie.
Yes, here I am. What a beautiful piece that was, because it's so heartbreaking to listen to a human and a bird talk to each other, and it's one of the most beautiful things in the world to do a duet like that. So, thank you very, very much. It was, and it struck me that that both of you two as well were using this structure of conversation that in what you were talking about, and I'd like to. Since one of my jobs here, I think, Carl, is to ask some questions of people. Okay, so I'm curious about what the role of conversation is in your work, because it seems like both of you are not doing sort of monologue-y things, but really engaging something in a kind of conversation. What you're also saying, I would love to hear more about your raven and dove, if you would just say a few more words about that, because that seems like a really very intense potential conversation. Could you spin a little bit on that?
Yeah, Laurie, I think for me, I think I've sort of always been in conversation with birds. I grew up with 3 television channels, really 2.5. And my thumbs aren't larger than normal because there were no video games. So I talk with these birds. And so these instances of trying to imitate them and sometimes getting a response, or what you think is a response. And so that's a validation of sorts. And I think at sort of the base of our being is often this desire for validation. And so birds were validating me in ways that humans didn't. And so hearing Paul's, hearing that duet moves me in a way that I couldn't quite explain until you asked that question about conversation. So I think it's important now more than ever that we are in conversation with one another, certainly, but across the sort of interspecific taboos which we don't think that we can communicate, but just ask your companion animals, right? And this understanding that they have of us, but then that wild things have of us is, Carl, you were talking about this owl, this screech owl, that you have this relationship with. I mean, what is that like for you?
It's a little unfair because my relationship with her and my wife Patricia's relationship with her is so unusual. So this is a screech owl that was dragged out of its nest somehow by something and found on the ground. It's not on? Okay. Not sure. It's on. Just can't hear me. A screech owl was dragged somehow out of its nest, a little tiny, downy chick, and dropped on the ground somehow, and then found by someone, and eventually made its way to us. Came to the right place, I have to say. And that was 4 years ago, and we raised this little owl and opened the door, and she left, but she came back a few days later, and she's been there for the last 4 years in our yard. She got a wild mate. She raised 2 broods of 3 chicks each, and very coincidentally, that first year of her freedom coincided with the first year of our lack of freedom due to COVID. So all of our travel was canceled and left me with the ability to watch our owls for about 5 hours a day, getting up right before dawn and watching them for 2 or 3 hours, getting out right before sunset and watching them for 2 or 3 hours, taking lots and lots of notes because I thought maybe there's going to be a book here. I don't know how this is going to turn out. And that was a tremendous gift to be able to be at home and make that connection. But the remarkable thing about our conversation with her is it's literal. We call, she always returns my calls. The only member of my family who always returns my calls. And she's still, I mean, I've actually had a lot of experiences with captive wild birds, and I assumed she would get a little standoffish and put some distance between us. And other wild orphans that we've raised, usually they get to adolescence and then they do what they normally do to their parents. They disperse. And this was always true with life on Earth before millennials. And they... So, like, for instance, just the other day, I noticed right at dawn, I went out right at dawn, and she was in the bird bath. So I walked over to the bird bath, and she looked at me, and she hopped on my shoulder. Now, this is a bird that's been wild for 4 years and is not, has no domestication history of any kind. They shouldn't be orienting necessarily to a human, but we have a relationship. And sometimes when I call her and she answers, there's 4 levels of different kinds of vocalization. And I am familiar enough now to understand the context that brings those specific vocalizations. And I've read about screech owls and bird guides and stuff for a long time. Everybody knows they have 2 calls. They have a whinny and a trill. And let's see if I can do the trill. I charge for lessons. But actually, they have about 7 calls, and a lot of those are uttered only very intimately with their mates, and intimately, in this case, with me and Patricia, because we are family. And it's really, it's magical. That's what I can say about that relationship. And it is the subject of a book that I'm just finishing. That'll be out in about a year. So, yeah.
Of those 4 calls, what is she telling you?
Okay, so one of the big things about their vocalizations is that within the different calls, meaning has a lot to do with context and intensity of the call. So it may be the same call. She may do the whinny, but if she, and that's usually a call that means, I'm over here, where are you? If she doesn't know where we are, or if she's calling to her mate, or she hears another owl, she'll do that really loud enough that our neighbors 2 backyards away can sometimes hear her. But if we call her, I usually call her with my imitation of screech owl because I get a kick out of it. Patricia just goes out and she says, "Where are you?" And of course, she knows our voices. She knows exactly who is doing that. So she usually appears within a few moments. And then that whinny will be very soft because it's obvious where we are. And she's just saying, "I'm here. You're there. It's good. We're together." That's what I needed to know. But it's very, very soft. Then she does a thing that I call her cozy call, which I've never heard of in any other description of screech owl vocalizations, because no human would ever hear this call, because it's a really intimate call of an affectionate, a filial sense. And usually she utters it from the nest box. She'll go in the nest box, turn around, stick her head out. She'll do this with her mate. But in the non-breeding season, when she's really interacting with us, she'll do it with us too. And that's just it. She just goes like, it's a little emphatic and very breathy, and it's just I don't know exactly how to describe there's a sense of like, let's get close. That's the sense of that one. Then if she's looking for her mate, like if he's off hunting and she wants to know really, well, like exactly where are you? I need that food now. The kids are really hungry. Then there's what I call the loud contact call, which is she'll just go, ow, 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 ow. And if there's no answer, after a while, there's what I call the emphatic call, which is one of those really loud. Ow! Where are you? I need to know now where you are. And sometimes after dark, where I can't see them anymore, I mean, it's very, very hard trying to follow owls around. I used to be a professional ornithologist and watch birds for many hours, sit in the blind, you watch them, and they make noise, they move. When they move, it's surprising, you don't think about this, but you hear them fly. Owls, first of all, make no sound at all, and it's dark out, so good luck trying to find them. But I can hear them doing these different calls in the woods, and as they're keeping track of themselves and their family and their kids, when the kids fledge, and the kids have another call, it's like a rattly kind of a thing, I can kind of, like I know what's going on after a while, and it's an astonishing thing to do that. And very luckily, we were stuck at home, and that was the silver lining of that, was it let us, and this is something I heard from a lot of people, being stuck at home let us pay attention to our yards and our gardens and our neighbors even. And so it was a horrible thing. I would never want to repeat it, but there were lessons in it, and there was a silver lining in that.
Do you can you say what birds are telling you?
At times, I'd like to think that I can. For me, it has been with ravens, and ravens have so much lore behind them, but they're also sort of this maligned bird, and so we're at the edge of their range in the southern Appalachians. So I have a little mountain place, and ravens nest on the ridge north. But they make these forays south, and I've recognized you can hear them up on the ridge, just that, and these chortles that they make between one another. Crows will do this too. If you listen, Carl has talked about these sort of almost subsonic sounds that birds make. Crows are constantly talking. And so ravens, these big crows, are talking to one another, but then they'll make these forays south, and occasionally I'll call at them, and you can see the ravens swivel their heads, right? They're big schnoz, and so you'll see them swivel, and they'll disappear, and you may hear them call back. It's usually delayed, but for a while I thought they were just watching me, which is what they do. They watch you. And sometimes from places where you can't see them. And one day I was unaware that I was being watched until this bird chortled. And then it up, and I called back, and it flew directly at me. Flew at me, maybe 40 feet above my head, and then just turned and went the other way. And I could hear its pinioning. And so that I think I have a relationship with this bird, but it's on the bird's level, right? So to come to this place to understand that they know more about us in this way that we can never know, And you know, we talk about that, the not knowing part and what we can know. So yeah, I try to talk back to them. I've had the most success, I guess, with ravens. And so they're very special to me in that way. And so you'd ask about that tension sort of that exists with them. You know, ravens are large, black, playful, intelligent beings. I can relate. So, I mean, that's a thing. But there are also birds that are persecuted in a lot of places. I refuse to call a group of crows a murder. Sorry. I call them a council. Because their crows are making decisions. Research shows that they recognize our faces. Crows mourn. They mourn, at least in the sense that we think of it. So the intensity with which they do that, we can't know. But they, you know, these birds that greet one another, that know one another, that they recognize, you know, a bounce and whinny from Carl or from Patricia. Hey, where are you? So I think our knowing of what they know is limited, but in that space that Carl was talking about, that in-between space is wonder. And that if we reside in that wonder, it provides all sorts of opportunities for us to connect. So conservation or conversation is really just connection. So that's sort of how I see it, and I get that with ravens.
Just thinking of mourning birds, birds mourning of a friend of mine who has an African gray, and she has about 20 animals, and they're all kinds of animals. And when rabbits, chinchilla, turtles, cats, and when one of them died, there used to be like a real pall over the whole menagerie because, and then she finally realized what she needed to do was to leave the dead animal there for a while, so the rabbits and everybody could come up and sniff and kind of go, "Oh, Fred's dead," and the African gray would then, speaking of talking animals, would say that animal's name for a couple of weeks, you know, Betty, Betty. Betty, Betty, you know, just, and I also have one of my brothers has an African gray who's, they have a vocabulary of maybe 500 words, and this one talks exactly like my brother, and he does kind of like one-way phone conversations. He kind of goes, and complete with the sounds of the phone too. So he goes, hello, yeah, yep. Yeah, this is Chris. Yeah. Okay. Friday? Yeah, Friday would be okay. Okay. And then he kind of does this, the phone hanging up, you know. So he's like, what is this bird doing, you know? And so I really love talking animals, and I brought some records of a parrot that I made, which does one long run-on sentence, which is about an hour, and it's a animatronic parrot, and fancifully enough, his beak moves, you know, which is a ridiculous thing because parrots do not have lips, you know, so they talk like this. They don't. So I decided to articulate the language so that the beak would do that, which it doesn't need to do, and it never does. But so just because I had an envelope follower and it was a cool thing to do, so you know. But anyway. I do have the feeling that I'm having conversation with animals in many ways, and Carl, did you want to say anything else about that?
About having conversations?
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to ask Paul, how did you get such a good recording of
beautiful.
that particular bird, first of all, and much more deeply, you were a jazz musician, but somehow got very, very drawn not only to nature, but to the whole, you know, like enveloping nature and your music totally together. And how was that evolution in your life and work?
The first question about the recording, if you leave your machine under the tree for 40 hours, you're bound to get something. And the question, it just took me a long time to get the time to go through them all and see if we had found our holy grail, and we did, and you heard it. It's luck, it's a great deal. I'm not a recording engineer, but I can put the machine on the ground and go away. The whole what I call the greater symphony of the earth was open to me, the gateway to it. On a night late in May in 1968, when I went to a lecture by Dr. Roger Payne at Rockefeller University about whale songs. And hearing the songs of the humpback whales was very much, for me, like the first time I heard Charlie Parker. There's no difference. It's all this yearning voice of life. And the poignancy of the whales, of those recordings, touched the hearts of millions of people around the world, and I probably did more for the cause of whales than all the talk and books and symposia put together. And I think it was that kind of yearning that attracted me to jazz early on, having played classical music first and been doing that just because it was something that my family members were expected to do. But it was hearing big bands and hearing players that put some kind of human soul into their instrument. That was my allurement to music, to life. And I hear that now in every culture that I go to, and I hear it in all the creatures, the yearning. And it's fascinating to think, what is that? And I think it's yearning for connecting. And I love the fact that the state I live in has connect in the name. And it's enough to have a communing. I remember early on in the enthusiasm about whales from the 1970s after Roger's album came out. And there was a big fervor for let's communicate with the whales and find out what they're saying. And John Lilly was kind of the leading proponent of this and did amazing research and learned probably a great deal. And after a while, and having had then the chance to go out with a Greenpeace expedition and be in a small raft near whales, I felt so amazed that I was allowed, that they let me be there. I mean, if you're in a Zodiac and you have a 60-foot whale surface beside you with an eye that big, who could swamp you with just a nudge, and they don't. And I felt, what a privilege, just to be with them. And over the years that I've played in the wilderness, it's so rare that that any animal will stay put if they smell or hear you. The wolves disappear. And when you do get that rare chance to be there together, it's enough to just commune. And I don't care about, I don't know if we could understand what they're saying. And I think if we did, we'd put it in a box and put it on the shelf and go on to something else that was a mystery. Let's love the mystery. And somebody said, they may have answers to questions we haven't even learned to ask. And so let's be humble and continue our journey together with them, and maybe some of the answers will come, but it'll be fine with me if they don't, because I'm glad to be here with all of you.
That reminds me of that reminds me of one thing that John Lilly was talking about, because it's one thing to hear animals in the wild, but he spent a lot of time with dolphins in their tank and swimming around with dolphins who are swimming around and around in a tank in an aquarium. And somebody said, do you know what those dolphins are saying? And he said, yes, they're all questions. And they said, well, what do you mean, like questions? And so he said, one of the questions the dolphins keep asking us are, do all oceans have walls? I think he really understood what they were saying to him about wildness.
You're talking about, maybe we don't understand, maybe we can't understand. But I think there is at least one thing that we could generalize about all of these callings, and that is that it is a yearning to know that we're not alone. I think that's common to all of this. Does anybody have any questions? Not about how to care for your parrot. Edwina.
I have a question for Drew. I talk a lot about nature-friendly landscapes, and I was down in New Orleans a couple months ago and presenting about my subtopic, and I generally wander into the creation of bird habitat in yards. And a large number of the audience asked me, what about the crows? And I said, what about the crows? And they said, well, they're bad. And I said, well, I'd never heard of crows being bad. And they said, well, they are. And I said, well, I don't know about that. I'm going to have to get back to you. And I haven't been able to find anything bad about crows, and I got to get back to them. So can you help me?
Well, thank you for that. It links in really to this question, to this response of communing and what birds are saying. And as Paul has spent so much time in other cultures in music and sort of this cross-fostering, different peoples have different ideas about birds. And some of those we brought with us, and you go to different parts of the country and you'll learn some of them. I have a friend who was talking. I had done a presentation and had talked about all these birds, and I talked about meadowlarks, which is a common, sort of relatively common bird of open habitats. But his statement to me about western meadowlarks were, because we had talked about differences in songs between eastern and western meadowlarks, and now there's another species. But anyway, those two species, and he told me, he said, my people, and he was speaking of his band of Lakota, he said, my people, that bird always tells us that somebody is coming. And it wasn't, so his prism of how his people see that bird, it really interested me in how we sort of partition. And so a lot of our construct is Western construct from a scientific standpoint. And Western construct in terms of language tends to be very linear. And so good or bad, right? The bird is good, the bird is bad. And so, think about sort of the real stew or roux that New Orleans is, and all of the influence that you get there, and what birds mean. And people will say, well, you're always making it about race, and really I'm not, but sometimes it is. When you can't find very much good about black birds, you just don't. It's one of the reasons that icterids are in decline. That in any given city where black birds roost, or even crows, it's relatively easy to get licensed to do away with those birds or to harass them. There are seasons on crows in many states. Did you know that? Yeah, oh sure. There are seasons on crows in many states. Now, crows are songbirds. They're our largest, but a lot of people who knew that crows were passerines were songbirds. Right. So if you think of that as the same thing sort of in a family way as a chickadee, the bird becomes different, doesn't it? But no one ever refers to corvids or to crows or ravens as songbirds. You don't see them as poster birds for songbird conservation. You see them taking things, there's a murder of crows, and it sounds, oh, murder of crows, they're sinister. So that's where some of that comes from, right? Those birds are going to come in, and I think the other sense that people have with anything that they say is sentient, which I mean, that's a judgment call. But crows are looking at you, and they're thinking things about you. You just be in the presence of them. They're thinking, it's like that African gray. Looking at a parrot's eye, and when they're looking at you and sizing you up and down, and you've made a commitment of decades to this bird, and it knows that you're not going to carry through, or the parrot knows your issues. Oh, it's a real thing. People commit to parrots and don't commit to parrots. And the parrots develop parallel psychoses. So it's easy for people to, in certain places, to sort of glom on and say, well, that's a bad bird. But then I also, for my grandmother, every time, before I do an owl call, I sort of silently ask for her permission, because owls were bad omen for her. They're bad omen, and that's across quite a few cultures, that they're bad omen. So in that way, thinking about that to culture and putting it back to culture, I think helps for me.
Don't you think that with all the one useful thing I think about the internet, besides everything else, is that people watch videos about animals, and I think that all the videos about watching crows using tools and being so ridiculously intelligent, in fact, all the corvids, I think that the more people have access to witnessing their intelligence, the more people respect them. I hope to God. But we love our bird feeders and watching our birds and getting to know them a little bit. And I think that that's another thing that the pandemic was great for, because a lot of people got bird feeders and really became attached. So I'm hopeful, cautiously hopeful, that there is a change. And people frequently say to me, but how do you keep the grackles away? And I'm like, they need to eat too. So you just feed them a little more, and everybody eats a little more, and it's all right. It's all a thing. And by the way, I just want to tell everybody that at 4:00 on Tuesday, at 5:30 on Tuesday, Edwina is going to be telling us about her program, 2/3 for the Birds. And if you have been at all inspired by all this extraordinary conversation, I hope you'll come back here for that. Excuse me for the plug. 2/3 for the Birds is the name of, I should be handing the mic to her, but it's her program trying to teach people how to keep their landscapes bird attractive, not just bird friendly, but actually bird attractive. It's a wonderful thing, and it's expansive.
Could you just say a minute elaborate?
Oh, okay. So it's based on Doug Tallamy's research. He's an entomologist, and he proved that if you have 70% native plants in your yard, and it was in response to the bird decline, and you do not use pesticides, you can contribute to thriving bird populations and the return of our birds, because so much power lies in the hands of the individual, and non-conservation and non-agricultural lands, if we can restore them to healthy habitat, and birds are the harbingers for everything else. So I'm really a plant person, but people respond a lot better to birds. So I call this initiative 2/3 for the Birds, because it's 2/3 rhymes better with birds than 70%. So that's
also, in
what it
defense
is.
of ravens and crows, one of the most beautiful books I've read in the last couple of years is A Most Remarkable Creature, about a South American crow by a writer named Jonathan Myberg. So if you're interested in an incredibly intelligent raven crow, that is a wonderful, wonderful book to check out. A Most Remarkable Creature by Jonathan Myberg, Meiburg. Weinberg.
So we're going to have one more. Oh, this one's Anyway, one more question. Finney has a question. Finney needs a mic, and then we're going to play, and that will close us out. And we'll come and sign any books anybody wants signed. But Finney, go ahead.
That parrot you were talking about who did the phone conversation imitations, do you have any recordings of that?
My brother has a website for it. The parrot's called Uncle Bob. I'll give you the website later. It's like, yeah.
Okay, so in those days when I was trying to sneak into Paul Winter concerts, I heard a song that I thought was just extraordinarily beautiful. It's not quite about a bird. It's about a guy who wanted to be a bird, and he had wings that he made out of wax, and he flew too close to the sun, and the wax melted. And his name is Icarus. And I love that song so much that I had a red-tailed hawk. I got a red-tailed hawk, and I named that hawk Icarus. And I always thought, well, you know, the apex of my drumming career would be to someday play Icarus with Paul Winter. And that's what we're going to do.